But Shalom. So I want to begin this morning by looking at something that I already looked at earlier this week. The question of the brothers eating at Joseph's house and why there are three tables. Okay, now of course at this point, he knows who they are, but they don't know who he is, right? And that one of the things that we read this morning is Ki Hamalitz Beinei. In other words, he used a translator, right? He used, and it reminds me of there's a scene in the Woody Allen movie Bananas, right, where he's using a translator, even though they're all speaking English. But this is the opposite. Okay, so he understands their Hebrew. He's perfectly capable of speaking to them in Hebrew, but he wants to maintain his anonymity, so he speaks to them very harshly in Egyptian, and then there's a translator. So then when he overhears, and of course, you know, anybody who speaks another language, you probably had this instance where you overhear people saying things that if they knew you understood their language, right, they wouldn't say it, right? In fact, I had a cousin who was a lawyer, and he didn't have a particularly Jewish, I don't know whether he changed his last name or somebody else did, but last name was Lowell, which is not exactly a Jewish name. But he had gone to yeshiva and he knew Hebrew quite well. And he was involved in a case, and the other side were Israelis. And he went to the bathroom during the break, and they were in the bathroom talking to each other. And they said some things that they wouldn't have wanted him to say. So he said something to them like, he said, right? It's a beautiful day today. And their faces went white. And they said, oh, okay, let's settle. And they had a settlement because they had no idea that he understood Hebrew. But anyway, so now they're at lunch, and there's three tables, right? The brothers are at one table, and Joseph's Egyptian staff are at a second table, and Joseph is eating by himself at a third. Right now, the first question is why don't I mean, could you imagine like throwing a party, right? And you say, okay, like, right, you assume you have a big family, right? You invite some other people, say, okay, this is the table for the guests, and this is the table for the family, right? It doesn't, right? Nobody does that. I mean, you might have like the day is, I don't know, if it's a bar mitzvah or something, right? But imagine inviting people for Thanksgiving, and the guests are at one table and the families. We don't do that, right? But why can't the Egyptians and the Hebrews eat together? Yeah.
Because it keep it kosher.
Well, that possibly. I mean, that's my midrash, right? That's my midrash. Because you could. I mean, it's possible to eat kosher and non-kosher at the same table. Right, but it's complicated, right? I mean, if you want to really be strict, you actually need a mechitza at the table, okay? Not like a literal wall, but you know, some sort of visible separation between the kosher side and the non-kosher side, right? But it's actually not about the religious needs of the Hebrews, it's about the religious needs of the Egyptians. I mean, the text says, Lo yuklun hamitzrim lachol et ha'ivriim. The Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews. Ki to'e bahi l'Mitzrayim. It is an abomination to the Egyptians to eat with Hebrews. Okay, and the question is why? And anthropologists tell us because they were different types of society, right? The Egyptians were farmers, right? They lived in towns, and they could be farmers because the Nile floods fairly reliably, and you can have agriculture, you can grow things, right? Whereas the Hebrews are shepherds, right? And on the scale of anthropological evolution, town-dwelling farmers are higher than shepherds, right? So, and I've mentioned this before, right? I mean, you will occasionally see something about how Israel mistreats the Bedouin. Israel does mistreat the Bedouin, right? So do the Jordanians, so do the Palestinians, so do the, right, everybody does, all the governments do, because governments like people who have addresses, right? Because if you have an address, the government can come and find you and make you pay your taxes, right? The government likes people who recognize there are borders, right? If you don't recognize there are borders, then you don't consider it smuggling, you consider it trading, right? Because, and so everybody mistreats the Bedouins because the Bedouins don't fit in, right? And so now Israel said, Israel tries to force the Bedouins to live in towns. Okay, but the Bedouins don't want to. They want to, right? So the question of do I have a right to make, I don't even want to go there, right? But the Egyptians despised the Hebrews. But what about Joseph, right? I mean, Joseph is accepted at this point as an Egyptian, right? But he knows that he's still a Hebrew, right? So the question of kashrut, and the point that I made earlier this week is that in a way, Joseph is a model for diaspora Jews, in my opinion. That is to say, you live in a certain culture and you have theoretical equality within that culture, and maybe even as Joseph, a position of authority, but every once in a while you're reminded that you're not fully of that culture, right? And in last week's Parsha, right, Joseph is still in prison because somebody promised, oh, I'm going to take care of this. I'm going to speak to Pharaoh. I'm going to get you out of prison. And then he forgets, right? This week, Joseph is the second most powerful man in Egypt, but he's still set apart, right? He's not fully a part of the society in which he wields so much power. And one of the things that I find interesting, and I haven't really, explored it in depth, right? But Pharaoh gives Joseph an Egyptian name, Sophnat Paneh, right? But he's never called Sophat Paneh. He's always called Yosef, right? And the text says, Pharaoh tells the people, you're hungry, go see Yosef, right? Why doesn't Pharaoh say, go see Sophnat Paneh, right? Other than Yosef is shorter and easier to pronounce. I don't really know. I mean, was he ever really known by his Egyptian name, or did everybody know that he's Yosef? right? And even though he's, a high-ranking official, he's still, Yosef, that Jew, right? And December, I think, comes to remind us that we are not fully a part of the society in which we live, right? And it comes around Christmas. And I want to tell you, to a certain extent, both sides of this argument are correct, right? Because, for example, like we have a tradition every year we go to the Gaithersburg Winter Lights, right? And most of it is Christmas, right? But none of it is religious. It's Santa, and it's tin soldiers, and it's gifts, and it's Christmas trees, right? And a religious Christian would say, this is not religious, this is not right. I mean, if you wanted religious, a manger scene, right? These are secular manifestations of Christmas, right? But a Jew says, nevertheless, they are secular manifestations of Christmas, which means what? Christ Mass, right? They are secular manifestations of a Christian holiday, right? And we see, rampant attempts by the Christians to impose their hegemony on us, and they see nice things that who could possibly object to, right? And in fact, they're both correct, right? Because, empathy means feeling with, right? And to feel with somebody, you have to try and feel the way you would feel if you were there, right? And that's really, really hard, right? Because, for them, Christmas is like just nice, right? And for us, it's like, it can be, right? I mean, and conversely, frankly, I think, I don't know how to say it, so I'll just say it. The more Jewish you are, the less it bothers you, right? Because you know that, look, I don't fit fully in this society, right? And there is a difference between my legal right to equality, right, which should be enforced and enforceable, right, and my right not to feel alienated or uncomfortable, right? And I am not aware of anything in the Constitution or the US Code that says, all people have an inalienable right not to feel alienated or uncomfortable, right? It's part of living in society, right? The difference is, and look, I mean, if you are a religious evangelical, you also feel alienated and uncomfortable all the time, right? The difference is that many of them don't understand that this is a pluralistic society, right? And part of the price of living in a pluralistic society is that everybody gets to feel alienated and uncomfortable at times, right? And they want to pass laws that say, no, we don't have to feel alienated and uncomfortable, right? But, and how did Hanukkah become, the Jewish Christmas, right? It's because parents, I think, were uncomfortable with their kids, and so, and I have to say that to me, I love Hanukkah when it is not near Christmas, right? And like this year, and conversely, next year, the first candle of Hanukkah is December 25th, right? And Hanukkah continues until January 2nd. Okay, so all of Hanukkah is going to coincide with the Christmas Bacchanalia, right? But this question of feeling somewhat uncomfortable, right? And the difference between a legal right to equality and a legal right not to feel discomfortable, to me, a lot of the controversy of the things that are going on college campuses reflects this, right? In other words, I do not believe that college students have a right or should have an expectation not to be confronted with ideas that make them uncomfortable, right? I mean, if you are a Jew and you don't want to be confronted with ideas that make you uncomfortable, go to Yeshiva University, right? And you can't even say go to Brandeis, because Brandeis is only about a third Jewish, and there's a lot of activism that frankly makes most Jews uncomfortable, right? But we go to college to learn, right? And part of you don't learn if you don't confront and experiences ideas that make you uncomfortable, even if those ideas are outrageous and even if those ideas are ridiculous. Now, what you do have is a right not to face physical threats, right? And when protests turn violent, obviously that's unacceptable. When Hillel buildings or menorahs or sukkahs are vandalized, that's not acceptable, right? But we live in a society that is so diverse, right, that all of us are going to be confronted with things that make us uncomfortable, with things that alienate us. And that is the price. And I think that we have to learn as a community to distinguish between, what is legitimately physical harassment that we have a right to be protected against versus ideas that make us uncomfortable. I mean, I'll give you one example. Okay, I shared yesterday, right, a survey that a political science professor at Berkeley did, right, where 47% of college students who support the slogan "From the river to the sea," right, don't know which river and don't know which sea, right? But at the same time, right, I see on Facebook, on Instagram, and I saw at the pro-Israel rally a few weeks ago, right? So their slogan is "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," right? And so I've seen memes that say, "From the river to the sea, Israel is all you see," or "From the river to the sea, Israel will always," whatever. And Palestinian slogans are going to be offensive and alienating to Jews. Guess what? Pro-Israel slogans are going to be offensive and alienating to Palestinians. Just a fact, right? I mean, you really can't ban one without banning the other. You really can't. I mean, if Jews have a right not to be offended, Palestinians also have a right not to be offended, right? And you can't, and you know, my solution, frankly, is grow up a little, right? Grow up and we're going to confront ideas that make us uncomfortable, and that's a part of education, and that's what it's all about. We don't have a right not to feel uncomfortable. We do have a right not to feel unequal, right? And therefore, we have a right not to have like creches paid for by our tax dollars, right? I'm not sure that we don't have a right to have Christmas trees and Santa's paid for by our tax. I actually like it when Santa comes up my street on a fire, right? What?
Skip door told us that.
He skipped your
Went down the street and just started.
anti-Semitism. Clear case of anti-Semitism. Anyway, Shabbat Shalom. And continue with the Kaddish Reform Musaf service 155 or 428. And then we'll continue to Musaf. We'll say the first two pages together through the Kedusha